Our presenters for this webinar will be Drs. Patricia Carrig and Brad Stolbach. Dr. Patricia Carrig received her doctorate in clinical psychology from the University of California, Berkeley, and is currently a professor and director of the clinical training and development of psychology at, part of the Department of Psychology at the University of Utah. She is an author of over 100 books, chapters, scientific papers devoted to understanding the factors that predict risk, recovery, resiliency among children, families coping with adversity and traumatic stress. She has been a recipient of numerous research grants, including the most recently a 4-year grant from the National Institute of Justice to support a longitudinal study of the emotional, cognitive, interpersonal, and psychophysiological mechanisms underlying the link between childhood trauma exposure and adolescent involvement in the juvenile justice system. She recently was named the editor-elect of the Journal of Traumatic Stress and has been a member of editorial boards of several other scientific journals. She also has been an active contributor to efforts on the front line to create trauma-informed justice systems and to remediate the effects of traumatic stress exposure on youth and families, including the National Child Traumatic Stress Network's Juvenile Justice Consortium and the Center for Trauma Recovery and Juvenile Justice. Dr. Brad Stolbach has devoted his career to ensuring that African American children and families in under-resourced, racially and economically segregated areas have access to services that promote trauma recovery. Dr. Stolbach is a trauma psychologist, associate professor of pediatrics at the University of Chicago Medicine, and is the clinical director of Healing Hurt People, Chicago, a trauma-informed hospital-based violence intervention program serving violently injured pediatric patients at UCM's Cromer Children's Hospital and John H. Strauger's Hospital in Cook County. Since 2009, Dr. Stolbach has served as the lead Midwest Regional Technical Advisor to the NCTSN's Complex Trauma Treatment Network. In addition to his work at the CTTN, he serves as a consultant and trainer for numerous programs and organizations, both within and beyond the NCTSN. Previously, Dr. Stolbach was the co-founder and director of the Chicago Child Trauma Center at Laura Betas Children's Hospital. Dr. Stolbach was the 2005 University of Chicago Medicine Urban Health Initiative Faculty Fellow, piloting the Project FIRE, a program for youth injured by violence that combined glass blowing and glass arts education, mentoring education, and trauma psychoeducation. We will also have a Q&A discussant, Mr. Eddie Boganagra. He is the executive director of the YMCA of Metro Chicago's Child's Youth Safety and Violence Prevention Initiative. He has pioneered many community-based programs to address trauma and build resiliency among those impacted by violence, including Urban Warriors Mentoring Program. Eddie has a bachelor's in arts and social work from Northeastern Illinois University and a master's from the University of Chicago School of Social Work Administration. Dr. Stolbach will begin the presentation. Dr. Stolbach?
Thank you, Kimberly. And I'd like to start off by saying that the topic today is really about trying to understand the context in which a lot of the violence that our youth are experiencing is happening. And so part of that context includes the frequent killing of black youth and men by law enforcement. So I would just like to start today by saying the name Alton Sterling and having a few moments of silence. Thank you. So both youth violence and gang violence in the United States, as well as child soldiering and the trafficking of youth in combat, are really huge problems. And so there are estimated to be about 300,000 young people conscripted into armed groups worldwide, and there are also almost 30,000 gangs identified in the United States, which involve nearly 800,000 youth. The United States has the largest youth incarceration system in the world, and currently we have over 80,000 of our youth locked up. Many of these youth report affiliation with gangs. Next slide. We tend to think of our youth that we lock up as criminals. The youth, the 300,000 youth around the world, are considered child soldiers, and this is just the definition of a child soldier. That's an internationally accepted definition. Child soldier is any person under 18 years of age who is part of any kind of regular or irregular armed force or armed group in any capacity, including but not limited to cooks, porters, messengers, and anyone accompanying such groups other than family members. The definition includes girls recruited for sexual purposes and for forced marriage. It does not, therefore, only refer to a child who is carrying or has carried arms. There is an attorney by the name of Christina Risen who's done some really groundbreaking work on looking at gang involvement as a form of labor trafficking. And she identifies in the International Labor Organization Convention concerning prohibition and immediate action for the elimination of the worst forms of child labor, several components of these identified worst forms of child labor that are highly relevant to youth involved in armed groups. The United States has ratified this convention, has not ratified the Convention on Rights of Children, but it has ratified this convention. So the worst forms of child labor involve including forced or compulsory recruitment of children for use in armed conflict, using youth for the production and trafficking of drugs, or work which by its nature or the circumstances in which it is carried out is likely to harm the health, safety, or morals of children. And Patricia will be talking about her research that bears specifically on this last point. So Risen points out that the types of services often performed by juvenile gang members, from selling and transporting drugs to engaging in crimes against persons, that's the next slide, and weapons crimes, fall under at least one of these enumerated worst forms of child labor. Next slide. So Patricia, in her work, has pointed out that we do not need to go very far to find child soldiers if we're conducting research on child soldiers, which we have tended to think of as being in other parts of the world. In fact, we have many of these youth in our own cities. And one of the reasons that they don't necessarily get viewed through this lens is that the kind of stereotype I think that people keep in their minds about a child soldier is involves children being abducted or forced into joining groups, whereas the recruitment of youth into gangs or street organizations tends to be much more subtle than that, and oftentimes to involve youth actually seeking out membership in the groups. Next slide. So we don't use this lens of a child soldier to think about our children, but what we instead talk about them as is documented gang members. These are a couple of quotes just from our Chicago Tribune, which daily gives us a rundown of everybody who was shot and everybody who was killed, how old they were, what hospital they went to, etc. So there's just a couple of examples. 2 17-year-old girls were hurt during a gang-related car crash, etc., etc., etc. It describes what happened and then ends by saying the 2 girls are documented gang members. A 15-year-old boy was shot in Englewood around 12:50 a.m. The boy was in a parked car when someone opened fire, etc. The boy was a documented gang member, and the shooting may have been gang-related. So these are the official statements that the police put out about our children after they're injured. And I just like people to think about if it were an article about a 15-year-old girl who had been either abducted or an attempted solicitation, that if it described that this young girl had been abducted and raped and then ended by saying the girl was a documented prostitute, and the shooting may have been and the rape may have been related to sex trafficking, that would strike us as really highly inappropriate. But this is how we think about our young children who are involved in carrying weapons. There have been laws passed that prevent a juvenile from being charged with prostitution. We are not there yet in terms of how we think about our young people involved in violent crime. Next slide. So the question is, why does it matter what lens we use to view our children? The lens that we have used and continue to use is the lens of a criminal. So this has serious ramifications for what we think are the solutions to the problems that we're seeing. So if we view everyone as a criminal, then our solution is that we lock them up. And we really love to lock up our children more than anybody else in the world. Many of our children are classified by statutes as adults based on the crime that they've been accused of committing. So they have not been convicted of a crime, they've been charged with a crime, and that charge turns them into adults as far as the court system is concerned. In different jurisdictions, this is an automatic process or a process that involves some discretion, but in either case, we are turning children into adults in the eyes of the law before they have actually had due process of being tried for the crimes of which they're accused. We particularly love in our country to lock up black and brown people. And in Cook County, youth of color are much more likely than other youth to be incarcerated, and African American youth are 46 times more likely than white youth to be incarcerated in Cook County's temporary juvenile detention center. Next slide. So we have a situation where by standards that have been accepted throughout the world in terms of how children ought to be viewed and treated, what's going on here is logically, I think, very easy to see as a form of trafficking, as a form of child soldering, and yet we persist in viewing our children as criminals. Next slide. So it's important for us to think about the context for this happening and how that context relates not just to the things that are happening now, but to the history of our country. the rate of violence in our city in Chicago is really pretty mind-boggling and has gotten worse over the last several years. And we're not at levels of homicides or shootings that reach where they were in the 1990s, for example. But what does seem to be true is that there are more and more young people, that the shooters and the victims are getting younger and younger as time goes on. Next slide. So when we have parts of our society that are disproportionately experiencing this level of violence, and the level of violence in Chicago is talked about as being, well, Chicago has this murder rate. There have been this many murders in Chicago. But the violence does not occur throughout the city. It occurs in certain areas of the city which are highly, highly economically and racially segregated. In these parts of our city, people do not have access to the resources that people in other parts of the city have. And so all of this violence at the individual level and the community level is happening in the context of another kind of violence, which is structural violence. And Dr. Paul Farmer, in his work, originally focused on the people of Haiti, talks about structural violence as one way of describing social arrangements that put individuals and populations in harm's way. The arrangements are structural because they are embedded in the political and economic organization of our social world. They are violent because they cause injury to people. Now, we tend to think about individual acts as being about the individual motivation or choice that's being made. He points out, in talking about structural violence, that it's not about culture or pure individual will. It's about historically given and often economically driven processes and forces that conspire to constrain individual agency. Structural violence is visited upon all those whose social status denies them access to the fruits of scientific and social progress. Next slide. So for many of our children who experience trauma, particularly this kind of trauma that we're talking about today, the context includes not just that traumatic event, but also historical trauma. For many of the youth who are involved in gangs in our city, it's the historical trauma of slavery, as well as the historical trauma of attempted genocide on this continent and the resulting social structures over the last several hundred years. So there's the historical trauma and racism at multiple levels: individual racism, cultural racism, and institutional racism. Next slide. For people who live as black people in America, there is constant chronic environmental stress that they're dealing with, and this is just a partial list of that. This is from the work of Nancy Boyd Franklin and A.J. Franklin, and they talk about unemployment, poverty, race-based stressors, microaggressions, invisibility syndrome, role strain, disproportionate incarceration rates, health disparities, education disparities, and residential segregation. When we tend to think about trauma and the impact that trauma has on individuals with whom we're working, we rarely include these kinds of adversity. And I think it's incumbent upon us in doing this work and in trying to understand what our youth are experiencing to start thinking about these other kinds of stress as important, if not more important, than the kinds that we typically focus on. Next slide. So, urban black and brown families face a unique set of adversities and stressors. The massive historical traumas of attempted genocide and slavery have never been addressed, yet create the context in which present traumas occur and are dealt with. Those of us working with children and families whose daily existence is shaped by the legacy of slavery and racial injustice cannot optimally intervene if we fail to understand and address the effects of the trauma of the past. Next slide. Just as in cases of individual traumatization, avoidance of acknowledging and addressing the traumatic past makes it impossible for integration to occur. As long as historical trauma remains taboo, the racial divisions and disparities that pervade every aspect of American life will persist. So, what I'd like to talk about now is moving from the biggest picture view of all this to thinking about what happens in the lives of individual children. Next slide. This is a boy, 16 years old, Pierre Lowry, who was shot and killed by a Chicago police officer in April of this year after allegedly threatening him with a gun. Police said that he had prior contact with police and that police considered him a documented gang member. So the question that we have to ask ourselves, and that the work Patricia is talking about is really groundbreaking in terms of trying to answer this question. The question is, how does this little boy get from here, next slide, to here? This is a picture of Pierre from his Facebook page that was posted soon before he was killed by a police officer. So this is the picture, and I even hesitated to put it in the slideshow because of this, but this is the picture that the media and the general public has in thinking about youth who are involved in gang violence. But I decided it is important to include it because if you really look at this picture, what you still see is a very young child. This is a child. He has a weapon. He has tattoos that mark him as a member of a group. But if you look in his eyes, you see what we see every day when we look in our children's eyes, which is a very young, immature person who is dealing with the circumstances in which he finds himself. Next slide. So, research on risks promoting gang involvement has identified a number of different factors. Those include community, disorganization, crime and violence, sociodemographics, economic disadvantage, lack of viable alternative opportunities, peers, delinquent peers, or precocious role. So you have children who are, from a very young age, functioning as if they're adults, and then they're influencing others around them as well. At the individual level, you have attitudes, pro-violence attitudes, callous unemotional traits that Patricia is going to be talking a lot about today, and substance use. Many of our youth use substances on a daily basis to manage their trauma and to regulate their own emotional functioning. And then there's the family factor, and what's been identified in families is poor monitoring neglect. We'll talk some about the family transmission of gang involvement, gang membership through generations. But it's important to remember when we take that family blaming route that many of the families that we're talking about have been traumatized across generations as well, and they're in communities that have been traumatized across generations. Next slide. So there's a lot of evidence that trauma does increase people's vulnerability for gang involvement. Some of that evidence comes from work that Eddie, our discussant, and I did a few years ago, where we just surveyed a few youth working in one of Eddie's programs, they reported the average number of different types of traumatic events that they'd experienced was 10, and the average age that they were first exposed to trauma was age 6. All of them had experienced physical abuse at home. All of them had witnessed community violence. 78% said they had witnessed a sexual assault. 89% of them had lost a loved one to violent death. So this is, next slide, one of those children, a young man we're calling Alfonso, 13 years old, who said, "The hardest part about seeing my best friend die was watching him trying to breathe while he was turning blue and watching all of his blood run down onto the sofa." Next slide. That scene that he described was one of 3 homicides that he had witnessed by the age of 13. This slide just shows you the list of different kinds of trauma and other adversity that Alfonso had experienced, and on the right side of the slide, the age he was at the time that these things occurred. So you have both single episode kinds of things as well as chronic, ongoing kinds of stress and trauma, and combined total for Alfonso of 15 different types of traumatic stress and other ACEs. Next slide. This slide shows you Alfonso's trauma history profile. This is the same information that we just looked at, but it shows you in a developmental context where he was, what else was going on in his life at the time that different things were happening. The black line on this slide is the first time that he performed actions on behalf of a street organization. That is when he held a gun for his older brother when he was 8 years old. So in terms of the definitions that we've talked about today, Alfonso was recruited to become a child soldier when he was 8 years old. Most of the interventions that focus on Alfonso and children like him focus on the choices that people make and how to make better choices. There's a flaw in this kind of thinking, which is that many of our young people are not making choices. They are simply doing what is the thing they need to do in the circumstances in which they find themselves. But the fact that he started on this path when he was 8 years old doesn't change what happens to him if he gets charged with shooting or killing someone when he's 15. Next slide. So we know from all of our work on developmental trauma and complex trauma that the kinds of experiences that Alfonso went through shape his development, shape a number of different developmental capacities that are important to functioning, and some that are highly relevant to functioning in a violent environment. So those include the ability to modulate, tolerate, or recover from extreme affect states, regulation of bodily functions, the capacity to know what's happening inside us, our capacity to describe what's happening inside us to others, capacity to perceive threat, including reading of safety and danger cues, the capacity for self-protection, self-soothing, the ability to initiate or sustain goal-directed behavior, the coherent self and identity, and the capacity to regulate empathic arousal. And several of these are highly, highly relevant to youth who are in environments where they are surrounded by, exposed to a lot of violence and to gang activity. Next slide. So these next slides have some similar kind of data from that Eddie collected. These come from a little bit older group of young people who were involved in a theater program called Changing Voices. It's part of Storycatchers Theater here. I'll talk a little bit about this later. But they were able to answer some questions about what they had experienced. Next slide. So for these young people, they reported their average age of first trauma exposure was around age 4. all of them had experienced at least one form of ongoing traumatic stress, with 5 of them saying that at least one stressor was present for their whole life. And they, as a group, had averaged 7 different types of traumatic stress before age 18. Next slide. They also had experienced many other types of adversity. Next slide. So as a group, similar to the group that Eddie talked to, they're averaging about 13 different types of trauma and other adversity prior to the age of 23. Next slide. So these youth also was able to ask about their own experience of gangs and violence. And 4 of the 9 reported that they had inflicted a violent injury on someone else. The average exposure for those individuals was 16. 4 of them reported that they had carried a gun for protection. Their average exposure was almost 17 different types of trauma. 2/3 of them reported having a family member that was affiliated with a gang or street organization, and 4 reported that they had been affiliated with a gang or a street organization. Those 4 said the age at which they first affiliated was 9, 12, 14, and 16. Next slide. So we're going to turn it over now to Patricia so she can talk a little bit more about her work trying to understand what the parallels are between our youth and youth in other countries, and also the pathway that youth take in order to end up affiliated with these groups.
All right. Thank you, Brad, for that very powerful start to this webinar. The work that I'm going to talk about today started with a conversation that I had with my colleague here at University of Utah, Cecilia Wainwright, who studies child soldiers conscripted into paramilitary groups in the context of the drug wars in Colombia. Cecilia shared with me the transcript of an interview she had done with a young girl who talked about her struggle coming to terms with what it meant that she was a person who was capable of killing another human being. And Cecilia wanted my input from a trauma-informed perspective about what it meant that the most traumatic experiences that most of these child soldiers were haunted by were not ways in which they had been victimized, but things that they had perpetrated on others. That intrigued me very much in terms of thinking about how there might be parallels between these youth experiences and those of the youth involved in gangs in the studies that we do in the detention center here in Utah. And as we turn to the next slide, you'll see that we found narratives in which we asked youth to identify the most distressing incident that they had experienced on our trauma interview. And they, too, would identify times in which they had been perpetrators of violence against others. So this set us down the path of considering how research into child soldiers in international contexts might help to inform our understanding of gang-involved youth in the U.S., who we came to term as America's child soldiers. So next slide. As we're beginning to see, trauma not only increases the vulnerability of youth to gang involvement, trauma is a potential consequence of involvement in gangs. Gang-involved youth are more likely than other youth in the juvenile justice system to become involved in violence, whether that's participating in violent crimes, but also they're at increased for being victimized, whether within the gang during violent initiation rites or in the context of committing crimes related to gang activities or being involved in gang wars. So it's not surprising that recent studies show a number of negative mental health outcomes among youth who become involved in gangs. Of particular interest is a recent study of mental health screenings that were conducted on a statewide sample of over 7,000 youth, excuse me, which found that gang members were almost twice as likely as other youth in the juvenile justice system to evidence symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. Next slide. But another way in which participation in gang activities might contribute to trauma is through forms of violence in which the youth are not victims, but rather the perpetrators. Robin McNair termed this construct perpetration-induced trauma, and it's also related to a newer construct of moral injury, which Litzer and his colleagues have proposed as a way of understanding how adult soldiers are affected by participating in or witnessing acts that violate their own moral code. As did Cecilia's research participant in Colombia, child soldiers often struggle to come to some sort of understanding of their role in the acts they've committed. And importantly, they don't see themselves as helpless pawns, but as active agents. And therefore, somehow they must come to terms with the fact that they either perpetrated or stood by as harm was done to another. And importantly, in the research on child soldiers in international contexts, it's been found that this perpetration of violence and the moral injury that entails accounts for which former child soldiers struggle with PTSD after they've been reintegrated with their communities. So we began to wonder, are these constructs relevant to gang-involved youth in the U.S., the child soldiers in our own backyard? And indeed, we're not the first to have this thought. Father Gregory Boyle, the founder of Homeboy Industries, writes eloquently in his book, Tattoos on the Heart, of the pain these youth wrestle with in the aftermath of perpetrating against others, and he termed this harm as harm. Next slide. Another important construct that's emerged in studies trying to unravel the link between trauma and youth involvement in gangs and the justice system is post-traumatic emotional numbing. Lansford and colleagues proposed that numbing emotions in the aftermath of trauma might be a kind of pathological adaptation in that it protects a youth from experiencing internal distress, but may increase the likelihood that they will act out that distress against others. This is consistent with the construct that Gillian Ford and his colleagues have proposed of survival coping, in which traumatized youth develop a callous facade that protects them against feelings of vulnerability. And some empirical research has offered support for these ideas. For example, in work coming from our lab, we found that post-traumatic emotional numbing mediated the link between trauma exposure and callousness amongst youth in the juvenile justice system. And next slide. One of the reasons why post-traumatic numbing is particularly important to study is that the new DSM diagnosis of conduct disorder includes a limited prosocial emotions, otherwise known as callous unemotional subtype. And this is often applied to youth who become involved in the justice system. Those with CU traits are conceptualized as possessing an inherent lack of empathy, remorse, and inhibitions against acting out against others, and are therefore at high risk of committing serious and violent offenses. Further, youth who are perceived as having these traits are unlikely to be referred for psychotherapy, but rather to have more severe sanctions placed on them. Next slide. And I just want to credit Dr. Monique Moreau with the idea for this graphic. Trauma theory suggests, however, that there may be a different pathway to callousness, and that might be via post-traumatic numbing. As Cartman originally suggested in his theory in the 1940s, we do in fact find a secondary subtype of youth high in callousness who also exhibit high levels of PTSD. These may be youth who dampen down their emotions in an attempt to cope with traumatic experiences, which over time may become generalized into a blunted and callous interpersonal style. But the theory also suggests that these may be youth highly in need of and capable of responding to trauma-focused psychotherapy. But if they're perceived as inherently hard-hearted, callous psychopaths, they will never receive that treatment. Next slide. There also are some reasons to wonder if there are particular risks for girls who become involved in gangs. There's some evidence to suggest that childhood trauma is an even more powerful predictor of gang involvement amongst girls than amongst boys. For example, as many as 2/3 of gang-involved girls report having been sexually abused as children. But in addition, girls in gangs are also at high risk of ongoing victimization, whether as part of their initiation into the group or as a condition of remaining in the group when they do join gangs. There's also a body of evidence to suggest that adolescent girls with a history of childhood trauma are more powerfully affected by new traumas, particularly when those take the form of interpersonal victimization. So all this suggests the possibility that girls may be more vulnerable to the effects of being associated with gang-related violence. Next slide. So weaving all these threads together, we carried out a study that had as its intention the goal of answering 4 main questions. First, in comparison to other youth in the justice system, do gang-involved youth exhibit higher levels of trauma exposure more generally and perpetration trauma more specifically? And do they exhibit higher levels of PTSD in general and emotional numbing in particular? Second, does perpetration trauma account for the link between gang involvement and PTSD? And lastly, are girls more vulnerable to these effects than boys? Next slide. So this study that I'm going to describe was based on a sample of 660 youth recruited from a detention facility. The research was conducted in Salt Lake, and so the demographics reflect those of the local juvenile justice system. Amongst these youth, about 32% reported involvement in gangs, and there were no differences between boys and girls in terms of their likelihood of gang involvement. We simply asked youth whether they currently or recently had been involved in a gang. We also asked them to complete the UCLA PTSDRI to assess post-traumatic symptoms and trauma exposure. And we also added a question to get at the idea of perpetration trauma. So on the list of the worst things that have ever happened to a youth was an item that had to do with whether they had done something to another person that was scary, dangerous, or violent. We also asked youth to complete the emotional numbing scale and the inventory of callous unemotional traits. So next slide. This displays the percentage of youth who acknowledged experiencing each of the types of trauma exposure we inquired about. Gang-involved girls are in red, and the boys are in bright yellow. What you can see on this slide is that overall gang-involved youth of both genders reported higher levels of many forms of trauma and violence exposure, including being a victim or witness to community violence and having experienced the death of a loved one. But particularly striking, if you look at the red bars, you see that gang-involved girls reported by far the highest levels of physical abuse, sexual abuse, and emotional abuse. On the next slide, you can see that gang-involved youth were significantly more likely than other youth in the justice system to endorse our item reflecting perpetration trauma. And although we thought we might find a gender difference in perpetration trauma, it didn't turn out to be statistically significant. This next slide shows you that gang-involved youth were more likely than others in the justice system to meet DSM-4 criteria for the PTSD diagnosis, including all three of the DSM-4 symptom clusters: re-experiencing, avoidance, and hyperarousal. On the next slide, you can see also that gang-involved youth reported significantly higher levels of the numbing of emotions, including general numbing and the numbing of sadness and fear. And the last bar shows that youth involved in gangs reported higher levels of callousness. On the next slide, this simply shows you that we tested through regressions the hypothesis that perpetration trauma would predict PTSD symptoms above and beyond demographic characteristics of the sample, gender, or gang involvement, and indeed it did. And finally, we were able to find evidence for a mediational model in which perpetration trauma accounted for the association between gang involvement and post-traumatic stress symptoms. So this next slide shows you that there was a direct relationship between gang involvement and post-traumatic stress symptoms. And the slide that follows shows the mediational effect that perpetration trauma accounted for this relationship between gang involvement and PTSD. Next slide. Just to summarize, the results showed that gang involvement and to a lesser extent perpetration trauma were related to higher levels of PTSD, emotional numbing, and callousness amongst the youth in this sample. Youth in gangs reported more trauma exposure than other youth, and girls in gangs experienced the highest rates of physical, sexual, and emotional abuse. Gang involvement and perpetration trauma were both associated with higher levels of PTSD symptoms and emotional numbing, and perpetration trauma accounted for the link between gang involvement and PTSD. So the implications on the next slide suggest that interventions for underlying trauma may be important for diverting gang-involved youth. And intriguingly, trauma, particularly perpetration trauma, may be a motivator for youth desisting from gangs. A number of studies have suggested that when youth are interviewed about their reasons for leaving a gang, implicated often are things that happened that they could not bear living with. So this seems like a promising avenue for future research. On the next slide, I just wanted to note a number of the limitations. This was a cross-sectional study, so we couldn't really test for the direction of relationships. We had limited diversity given the geographic location of our sample. We were limited to use self-report, used a DSM-4 measure of PTSD, and future research would benefit from using more complex measures of gang involvement, including those that differentiate between the roles that youth might play in gangs, whether as a hanger-on, fully jumped-in member, or as a leader of the gang. Another limitation, if we turn to the next slide, is that we had a very limited measure of perpetration trauma based on a single question. And to rectify that, one of the things that we've been working on in our lab is validating a new measure of moral injury, one that is appropriate for children and adolescents. To date, all the measures of moral injury have been focused on adult samples, mostly military personnel. What we've been striving to do with this measure is to assess moral injury in all the different ways in which it can occur, including acts of commission that are committed with agency versus under duress, acts of omission, simply witnessing bad things happening, experiencing those events with a sense of betrayal and a lack of ability to trust in those who should be trustworthy. And we were also looking at potential mitigating factors such as self-forgiveness and self-compassion. Turning to the next slide, another direction for future research is for us to better understand the circular and reciprocal relationships between perpetration and trauma. There are reasons to believe that perpetration results in trauma and that trauma begets further perpetration. If we turn to the next slide, one of our inspirations for this idea is the work of Dr. John Rich, who is an emergency room doctor in Boston, who noticed that the young men entering the emergency department with a penetrating injury from a gun or knife wound, among these, 44% would return with another such injury, and 20% would die within the time frame of 5 years. On the next slide, you can see the model that he developed. What he noted as he interviewed these young men is a number of common themes. One is that the violent experiences that were common in the lives of young urban youth, such as being shot, stabbed, or assaulted, contributed to the development of traumatic stress reactions. Moreover, many of these young people came to these experiences with a history of prior adverse childhood experiences that had never been addressed. So based on his observations, Dr. Rich developed a model of how trauma and the cycle of violence might be linked for young urban men who enter the emergency department. The cycle begins with the youth being shot, stabbed, or assaulted. The youth is then treated in the ER, often by medical personnel who attend only to the physical wounds, and question how the youth managed to get him or herself shot. But no matter how serious the injury, most youth are discharged with no assistance or preparation to deal with the psychological aftermath or social issues that could have a further impact on them. Youth may then begin to develop symptoms of PTSD that are likely fueled by their earlier adverse experiences. And in an attempt to cope with the intrusive thoughts, hyperarousal, nightmares, and sense of vulnerability, youth may resort to survival coping strategies such as carrying a weapon, believing that the violations of the broader social contract suggest that the police will not protect them. And they also, as Brad mentioned earlier, may begin self-medicating with drugs and alcohol. Another survival coping strategy to reduce feelings of post-traumatic vulnerability is retaliation against their attacker, which unfortunately increases the likelihood that a youth will be re-injured and that the cycle will repeat. Unfortunately, for all too many youth, the exit from the cycle comes in the form of either incarceration or death. The cycle this illustrates, is not uncommon to boys and young men of color, and unfortunately it's also not uncommon that there are no interventions that are readily available to help these young men and boys early in the cycle of violence. More often they're left to deal with the impact of the violent incident on their own. So trauma-focused interventions for victims of or witnesses to shootings, stabbings, assaults, and other violent crimes would help to break the cycle of violence, and these we're going to talk about a little bit next. Just briefly, I wanted to touch on a couple of other issues that I think are ripe for future research. On the next slide, we know very little about the role that ethnic pride and identification might have in either child soldiering or gangs, and to what extent there might be both risks or even protective factors inherent involvement in a group that promotes ethnic pride, especially in the context in which a group is subjected to discrimination. And on the next slide, by a similar token, we know little about the implications of the fact that for many youth, gang involvement is a family affair up to the third generation. And we don't often think about gang involvement as a way in which youth may be trying to make a contribution to their families. But that's certainly been found in the child soldiering literature, that some youth reported joining paramilitary groups because it was their only way to help provide their families with resources, food, clothing, protection. And so the involvement of youth in gangs may not be only a vehicle for a personal gain, but bringing home resources to the family. And then third, it's important that we know on the next slide better what the processes are that account for successful reintegration of those who exit armed groups and U.S. gangs. The children who were being rescued from gangs in international contexts were at one point being written off by their communities as future barbarians who couldn't be rehabilitated. But the research is actually very encouraging regarding the ways in which they can be successfully reintegrated and their trauma can be healed. But we need to know more about how those processes can be facilitated for youth leaving gangs, particularly for girls who endure other kinds of risks and challenges that marginalize them and run the risk of ostracizing them from their communities even after they've left the gang. I find it quite intriguing and quite telling that one of the rewards former girl gang members are most motivated to work for at Father Boyle's Homegrown Industries is tattoo removal. So for more about how we interrupt the cycle of violence, I'll turn the presentation back over to Brad.
Thank you, Patricia. So before I talk about some of the interventions that are going on in Chicago, including ones that we're involved in and ones that Eddie Bocanegra is involved in, I wanted to return to this cycle of violence, next slide, and talk a little bit more about beyond the kinds of trauma-specific responses and risk behaviors that are involved in this cycle, the kinds of trajectories that we hear about when we're talking to young people who've been affiliated with gangs. And in my conversations with them, typically they're either born into the gangs. They say this themselves, and as Patricia said, it could be multiple generations of a family that are affiliated. And that can be in the immediate family and the extended family. Or the other way that people describe is that they are befriended by other people who are affiliated. Those could be same-age people or slightly older people. And oftentimes this would be a young person in their early teens, and they would be befriended by someone who's, around the age of 20 or in their early 20s. And they develop individual friendships, bonds that are very strong, that are positive. And this parallels very closely what we know about sex trafficking and how young people initially get involved in sex trafficking. So what they're motivation is for making these connections typically has to do with, as they describe it, love, feeling valued, and also, very important for many of them, feeling like they get protection through these bonds that they have, that they're surrounded by danger, and that one of the ways, and sometimes they feel the only way for them to be safe from it, is to make connections to these folks who say, yes, you're with me now, and so you're protected. Of course, like many of the behaviors that increase risk, like carrying a weapon, for example, the perception of safety being increased is actually wrong, and the things that they're doing are actually increasing their risk, but they perceive it to be increasing the level of protection that they have. So I want to talk now about a few examples of interventions, and I'll say that these are simply things that are going on here that I happen to have involvement in. This is in no way saying these are the only, the best, or the answers. These are some things that I think have shown potential to be effective in helping individuals who've been involved in this violence. So the first one I want to talk about, and I'll spend the most time on this, next slide, is Healing Hurt People. Healing Hurt People was developed by John Rich and his colleagues Ted Corbin and Sandy Bloom at the Center for Nonviolence and Social Justice at Drexel University School of Public Health. And so you've already heard Patricia discussing this cycle. The idea of Healing Hurt People is that when someone gets injured and is treated in the hospital, we have a moment of opportunity to engage with that person, specifically around not just their physical injuries, but their psychological, emotional, spiritual injuries, and how they might get help recovering and healing from those. So instead of discharging folks, patching them up, sending them back out there to deal with what they're dealing with, we're trying to engage them and talk to them about the impact of trauma. Next slide. So at the center of Healing Hurt People is intensive case management. And that intensive case management begins when we first engage children and their families, ideally at the time that they're in the hospital or at the hospital, and then continuing after they're discharged. Intensive case management can focus on many, many areas where people might need help. The idea is that we're trying to help them identify what their needs are and what their goals are, and then figure out together with them, okay, these are my goals, here are the things that could help me achieve those goals, and then trying to facilitate them getting those things that they need to support them in their recovery so that they can accomplish their goals. And a lot of this is done through the individual relationship that they have with a trauma intervention specialist who is assisting them with systems navigation and modeling / mentoring how to deal with the systems in which they find themselves, and advocating also for them within those systems. The other component that I'll talk about in Healing Hurt People is the psychoeducation groups, which are self-groups that come out of the sanctuary model. Next slide. So this just shows you the flow chart of how people get connected to the program, and then the different services that they might receive as they are in the program. And so I've talked about the intensive case management navigation and the mentoring component of that. Everything starts with an assessment of how they're doing, what their needs are, what their goals are. Initially, the purpose of our contact with the patients and families is to engage them and provide some initial trauma-focused psychoeducation and support. So talking to them about how people respond after they've been injured. These are some of the reactions you might find you're having in your body. A lot of people will have these reactions as if they're back there at the time when they were injured. And when you start having these reactions like flashbacks or panicky feeling or feeling like you need to fight or feeling like you need to get away, you can feel like you're going crazy. And it's not crazy at all. It's actually completely normal. And if you can find ways to remind yourself, remind your body where you are and what's going on now, that can help your body to calm down. So we'll talk to them about that and talk to them about some breathing that they can do that will help them with that and help them stay grounded in the present. This is also very helpful oftentimes for their family members. Some of the worst traumas that the people we work with have experienced are moms who have learned that their son or daughter has been shot and they're not with them, and they're completely traumatized by that. So oftentimes when we're having these conversations about trauma psychoeducation, they're as much for the members of the family as they are for the individual patients. Next slide. Next slide. So the other major component of Healing Hurt People is self-psychoeducation groups. Self was developed as part of Sanctuary by Sandy Bloom, Ruth Ann Ryan, and Joseph Fodorero. Next slide. And SELF is a psychoeducation framework that focuses on teaching and mentoring participants and really first facilitating conversations about, as much as teaching about, safety, so planning for physical emotional safety, including avoiding re-injury and retaliation, emotions and how to manage the emotions, loss and or letting go. Many of our youth, their primary trauma that they will describe is the people that they've lost who are close to them who've been killed by gun violence. These can be family members, friends. Many of them have had both that they've lost, and many have had multiple losses starting at a very young age. So loss is extremely important for our kids, and then future. Many of our youth have not been given the message that there is a future for them. Many of them expect to die very young, and if they don't die, they expect to be locked up, or if they don't expect to be dead or locked up, they expect that they will not have opportunities to live a safe, happy existence where they have opportunities to work and make a living, and etc. Next slide. So this slide is just a quote from one of the members of our SELF group who talked about how the group had been helpful for him. And he is now one of our co-facilitators for our SELF group. So that's another thing that we try to do in this model, is to rather than having people, complete the program and then we say goodbye to them, we're actually hoping that we can develop some of them so that they have opportunities to actually get jobs doing this work, and also to be leaders within and beyond the program. So what he said is, when I first came here, I didn't really know what it was going to come out to. I thought it was going to be like us just sitting in circles talking about what happened to us, but I didn't think people really cared about African-American boys, young, like we just get shot, go to the hospital, and go home. And then I came here and I seen something different, learned something new. I heard everybody's stories. When I got shot, I didn't want to do nothing no more. I used to spend all my time in gyms, working out, just doing fun outside. Y'all made me look different. Y'all made me want to do all that again. So be able to go outside, kick it with people, family. I guess you could say I got my life back. So really what we're trying to do is to help people with their own trauma so that they don't feel like they just can't go anywhere. They have to be stuck in their houses and not do any of the things that give them pleasure in life, but that they can actually have their life back. Next slide. So one of the things that has grown out of Healing Hurt People is a program called Project Fire, and it was initially funded by a faculty fellowship here at the University of Chicago through the Urban Health Initiative. And FIRE stands for Fearless Initiative for Recovery and Empowerment. Next slide. So Project FIRE is an artist development employment program that offers healing through glass blowing to youth injured by gun violence. Project FIRE combines glass arts education, mentoring, and trauma psychoeducation in order to support trauma recovery and create employment opportunities for young people who've been shot or witnessed the homicide of a loved one. The picture there is one of our instructors, our mentor instructor, Nkosi Barber, who is an accomplished artist in his early 20s, as well as someone who's been through a lot of violence himself. Next slide. That is some of the work that's been produced by the youth in Project Fire. Next slide. So some of the youth have said, before this experience, I never thought about the future. Now I have something to look forward to. I used to be traumatized of nightmares. They taught me words to say in my head so I know I'm safe. I stopped being out in the streets. I'm more aware. It gives people another chance in life. It's an environment you can let go. Don't have to worry about outsiders. Next slide. Another program, and I alluded to this earlier in the presentation, that gives youth employment opportunities as well as experience to develop their talents in the arts, is a group program called Changing Voices. That's a supported employment program that engages groups of up to 12 recently released young people to develop and perform a musical addressing the challenges they face upon re-entry. And so these youth are taking their experiences, their traumatic experiences, both before they were incarcerated and while being incarcerated, and using those to create stories that then get shared with audiences in multiple different settings, but primarily with young people who are coming up behind them. It's a way for them to address their experience of trauma. Next slide. And Eddie can certainly talk more about this program during the Q&A, but Urban Warriors is a program that Eddie developed, which takes this idea of child soldiers very seriously and pairs young people who have been involved in the streets with combat veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan. And it's a mentoring program. It's also a program where they address trauma and incorporates understanding of trauma, psychoeducation about trauma, and also understanding the parallels between what the veterans go through and experience and the bonds that they have with each other and the bonds that the youth have with each other. Next slide. So these are some acknowledgments that Patricia wanted to make sure we included, and that is it for the formal part of the presentation, and so we'd like to spend the remaining time with some discussion and questions.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you for those wonderful presentations. We're next going to move into the question and answer portion of the event. You can submit your question by emailing question@nctsn.org. So we're going to go ahead and start the question and answer section by asking Mr. Eddy if you could talk a bit about about your experience and your youth's experience about perpetration and some things that you have experienced. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So to start off with, I just want to say thank you for this opportunity. The work that I get the chance to do here at the YMCA, we work with about 420 kids throughout the city of Chicago, predominantly in the west side and the south side of Chicago, which is where violence tends to be very concentrated. That being said, we know that chronic exposure to violence, looking at the Bruce Perry's work or even the ACEs study, we recognize that the more exposure to trauma they actually have, the more likely they're either going to become continue to be victims of violence or even perpetrators at some point. And so for us, it's important to kind of address the root causes of violence. In this case, we also recognize that many organizations that are working with disconnected youth, and by disconnected youth I mean kids who are typically involved in gangs, who are not necessarily attending school or the workforce, they tend to be, in many cases, as Brad pointed out earlier, the people who actually go into these hospitals as victims of shootings or assaults. In many of the cases of the kids that we work very closely with probation and the police department, so many of our kids in our programs are already just as involved. I think for us, the important part to recognize is the historical context of many of the communities that our kids come from. And we could talk about research, we could talk about different approaches to addressing violence, but the reality is that in many cases, no matter how much the YMCA or any other organizations are working with these kids, they tend to go back to the same communities, where in many cases are war zone communities, or even at home, where violence tends to stem from. So I think one of the creative ways to looking at violence, and particularly around trauma, is are there other creative ways that we could bring in individuals or institutions that are frequently experiencing very same levels of trauma that our kids are. And so in this case, we recognize the parallels between the kids that we serve and those of the veterans. And ideally, for us, it's like, well, who do our kids look up to, and who do they respect? And while we did an unscientific survey in the beginning several years ago, they identified the military, the veterans, as being one of the top two choices among others that were in the list: construction workers, teachers, police officers, and so on. And when we asked some informal interviews why veterans, they definitely identify with them because of the type of ranks they believe they also have, the fact they use weapons, the way that they're putting on their gang colors, and in many ways, again, it's the parallels between the military culture and that of the gang. And so in that was also this idea of many of our returning veterans, about 20% of them have been diagnosed or have symptoms of PTSD. Unfortunately for many of our kids, as we work with them on a day-to-day basis, we see a lot of the symptoms, but they often go undiagnosed. So if we have a difficult time bringing a lot of our kids to mental health providers, whether it's in downtown Chicago or in hospitals, how can we take a public health approach to inform them about what those symptoms look like? And so we do it in a number of ways. We explore topics of bereavement and loss, suicide, identity, manhood, just to mention just a few. And in those conversations, which is every Saturday for about 2.5 hours, we have these conversations with some exercises with the idea of not only building rapport between the veterans and the youth, but also, again, being intentional in having these conversations around specific topics. So that's pretty much in a nutshell.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Patricia, we have a question here. Can you talk a little bit about one of the pilot programs that you're involved with in LA?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I'd be happy to. I hadn't prepared slides on this because it is a pilot project in the early days, but I have to say that I'm pretty excited about it. This is something that I've been working on with Carly Durkheising at Cal State LA, and it's funded through the Gang Reduction and Youth Development Program of the Office of the Mayor of the City of Los Angeles. We initially started by thinking that it would be beneficial for gang intervention workers to be better informed about trauma so that they would be able to recognize and screen for post-traumatic reactions in the youth and families they work with, and also so that they would be better prepared to respond to traumatized clients in their caseloads. But one of the things that we recognized early on is that gang intervention workers themselves tend to come from the same neighborhoods as their clients, and they themselves have been exposed to a lot of violence and loss, and many of them are former gang members. So they come to this work with some vulnerabilities related to their own histories of childhood adversity and trauma, but also because of the experiences of their clients that they're exposed to, they're highly vulnerable to the development of secondary traumatic stress and vicarious trauma. So a large part of our intervention has been focusing on helping them to recognize their own secondary traumatic stress and to give them some tools to carry in their own toolboxes to hopefully prevent or to cope with the effects of secondary traumatic stress and vicarious trauma when they hear about the painful experiences and losses amongst the youth and family members they work with. We have collected a small amount of data from our initial pilot of the intervention, and we haven't yet looked at the data, but just the subjective comments of the participants suggested this is something that they received well and felt was much needed.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So this next question is actually for all of you. You presented a lot of information about some things that are going on. And Brad, we'll start with you, and then we'll go to Eddie and to Patricia. Can you tell us what are the next steps in your work, and what can we all do, those who are listening and participating in this webinar, what can we do to help move this work forward? Brad?
Thanks for the question. I'd say, for us, the next steps are to try to make these kinds of services available to as many youth as we possibly can. So that means expanding the work that we're doing, and also expanding the work to include not just those who are directly physically injured, but those who are affected because it's happening in their community, they're witnessing it, they're losing family members to it, etc. So that's really the next step here for our work with Healing Hurt People Chicago. As far as what all of us can do, I think there are two answers for me to that question, and I'm interested in what Eddie and Patricia think as well. But for me, number one is to help people to understand that children who get shot are children who get shot, regardless of their circumstances or what was going on and what led to their getting shot. They're children, and we need to do a better job of taking care of those children and providing different kinds of experiences and opportunities for those children so that they don't end up in situations where they're getting shot and killed. The other thing is to work with whatever system you work in to include this group of kids who oftentimes are put into a different silo. The silo they go in is the chronic disorder silo or the behavior disorder or the delinquent silo, and not into our silo, which tends to include people who are more readily identified as victims. So to try to expand those silos and work across silos so that kids are getting access to these services who might not have been initially thought of as victims necessarily.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Eddie, same question. What do you feel is the next steps in this work, and what can we, as webinar participants, what can we do to help?
So I think there's a couple things. I think first I just want to say, piggyback on what Brad said, I think there's amazing projects out there. Obviously, I don't know all of them, but the ones that I've seen show some promise, like the ones he mentioned, Healing Hurt People, the Fire Project. To me, I'll be biased, right? Urban Warriors, even though we've been doing research with the University of Chicago, we are seeing some preliminary results where we're seeing change not only with our youth, but also the veterans. So we're seeing change in two very marginalized populations. I think part of my perspective on this work, and as someone who's been a part of the problem as a young adolescent in the gangs, but also someone who grew up in these neighborhoods, I would say that part of what we need to continue doing, and this is why I'm so happy that we're talking about kind of this triangle between gang members, disconnected youth, if you want to call them that, child soldiers, but even in my case, working with U.S. veterans. And that is, how do we change the narrative of our young people? And I think you could use the research, you could use research such as the ACEs study or Bruce Perry's work around the neurological brain development and what does the impact of trauma actually have on a child in terms of the development. We could even talk about historical context, right? I think it's important for us to inform the larger audience about, often without any blame to our kids. Our kids are born to the parents they're born to, and these parents come from different marginalized communities or zip codes, as we often refer them to. And it is because of what they're born into, they already have kind of the world against them already. And so how do we really inform the larger audience about what it's like to live in these communities and the challenges that it is to live in these neighborhoods, while at the same time capitalizing on the resiliency of many of these families, individuals? I think it's important to not just focus on the negative side, but also acknowledge the goodwill that's coming out of these communities and build upon that. So again, for me, it's really how do we change the narrative? How do we think about providing psychotherapy or, among other type of kind of trauma-informed care for young people and their families, but not necessarily inviting them to what tends to be kind of like the perception in many cases of mental health institutions. Like how do we take more of a community-based approach to them, where we as clinicians are actually going into the community, engaging with them, informing them, while understanding against cultural competencies and the historical concepts of communities, with the idea of kind of figuring out a way, how do we build together? How do we build a community, a healthy community, where we could talk about these issues in a way that we can deconstruct them and build upon them?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And same question for you, Dr. Carrick. What are the next steps in this work, and what can we all do?
Well, both Brad and Eddie made such good points. I can only really underscore them. I think increasing access to mental health for this community is key, but all these interventions show us something really important, which is that it has to be done in innovative ways and ways that actively engage those communities. Anyone who, like me, has been involved in efforts to try and route inner city kids to traditional mental health services knows that that is not a winning proposition. So to make this accessible, we need these kinds of really innovative delivery systems and mental health services. And I also just want to really underscore what Brad had talked about earlier, which is the way in which the language we use tends to put a frame around these youth that leads us to not think of them, number one, as children, and number two, as victims. I think about the amazing strides that Rights for Girls has made in getting states to appreciate the fact that there is no such thing as a child prostitute, that these are sexually trafficked young people. And if we could have a similar kind of revolution in the language that we use for the children who are involved in these organizations, rather than thinking of them as small gangsters, I think that would be helpful as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. This concludes today's presentation. I'd like to thank our presenters and our discussant for sharing today. I'd also like to thank all of you for joining. Please remember to complete your post-presentation evaluation survey, and CEUs are available. Also, the Community Violence Collaborative Group for the NCTSN will be developing some ongoing activities, so keep an eye on your email address as we send those announcements out. Thank you again for joining today.